My name is Martin Cannon. I had abandoned this channel for a while. My documentaries took an awful lot of work, and frankly, the audience was small. But for some reason, more people discovered the channel after I walked away from the project. What's more, a few have told me that they like to hear these true life stories just before bedtime. Apparently, people don't care about those very time-intensive visuals. People want to hear about these mysteries, especially those mysteries which have not become overly familiar on YouTube and podcasts. So I'll be keeping an eye out for unusual stories that are truly unusual. Many of my stories touch on the paranormal. By no means am I asking you to believe in the supernatural. On that score, I have very mixed feelings. I respect science. I revere the ideals of the Enlightenment. That said, I do consider myself a Fortean researcher. I've been involved in that subculture off and on since the 1980s. My hope is not to engender belief. In the words of the great Fortean John Keel, belief is the enemy. What I want, most of all, is to entice you to do some further research on your own. If your findings are skeptical, great. If your findings are not so skeptical, also great. What we need is more data. Right now, I want to look at a few great mysteries from early American history. If you like these tales, well, there are plenty more. And if my telling of these stories puts you to sleep, well, for some people, it seems, that's the point. Our first story, The Stone-Throwing Devil, Newcastle, New Hampshire. Newcastle, founded as far back as 1621, is a town on an island. You can find it where the easternmost part of New Hampshire tickles the southernmost part of Maine. Today, the small but lovely town of Newcastle has fewer than 1,000 residents and masses of history. Tourists come here to see the Portsmouth Harbor Lighthouse, Fort Constitution, and Fort Stark. And some of them want to see the place where the devil once made his presence known. In the summer of 1682, the quiet coastal town of Newcastle became the stage for one of the most bizarre and terrifying paranormal outbreaks in American history. The protagonist of this supernatural drama was an affluent innkeeper named George Walton. He was a Quaker, in a time and place when Quakers were viewed with suspicion. In that year, a man named Richard Chamberlain came to the inn. No, not the actor. We're talking about the secretary of the New Hampshire colony, a respected government official, the kind of eyewitness one cannot easily ignore. He wrote a small book about the phenomenon called Lithobolia, or the stone-throwing devil. Chamberlain made it, whatever it was, famous throughout the English-speaking world. Now, a modern Fortean would classify this occurrence as a poltergeist case. But at that time, supernatural events were usually labeled witchcraft. So picture this. You are George Walton. You are comfortably settled in your tavern on a warm summer evening. The air is thick with the scent of salt and pine, and the gentle lapping of waves against the shore provides a soothing backdrop. Suddenly, without warning, rocks begin pelting your roof. The rocks seem to come from more than one direction, indicating multiple attackers. You rush outside, expecting to catch some mischievous youngsters in the act. But the moonlit yard is empty. As you stand there, bewildered, more stones rain down from the sky, seemingly materializing out of thin air. Chamberlain referred to this initial barrage as a lapidary salutation. This was just the beginning of Walton's ordeal. For the next 3 months, his home and tavern would be besieged by an invisible assailant with an apparently endless supply of ammunition. Rocks of all sizes flew through the air, from small pebbles to boulders the size of a fist. They would smash windows, denting walls. They terrorized Walton's family and guests. The entity, quickly dubbed the stone-throwing devil by the terrified locals, seemed to have a penchant for household items as well. Hammers, mauls, iron crowbars, and even kitchen utensils joined this aerial assault. Imagine trying to enjoy a quiet meal when suddenly your own pots and pans decide to take flight. Richard Chamberlain's account reads like a supernatural thriller. He describes waking one Sunday night to the sound of rocks pelting the house. Venturing out with Walton and others, they were met with a barrage of stones, seemingly thrown by invisible hands. Back inside, the terror continued. Rocks rolled down hallways, pebbles rained from the ceiling, and at one point, Chamberlain narrowly avoided being brained by a large rock as he closed a door. The poltergeist seemed to have a wicked sense of humor, or perhaps a flair for the dramatic. In one instance, a stone was found lodged within a pane of glass. Yes, the rock made a hole which was a perfect fit for the rock itself. It was as if this devil was showing off. Maybe it thought it was playing rock Tetris. Despite the frequent peltings, Walton somehow kept his business going, even though the strange precipitation could not have pleased his guests. Good thing they did not have Yelp in those days. The reviews would have been brutal. Now, this was New England in the 1680s. As noted earlier, anything supernatural was considered witchcraft. Witchcraft requires a witch. People felt that someone had to be responsible for these attacks, and what transpired was literally a witch hunt. The prime suspect was one Hannah Jones. She was an elderly neighbor with whom Walton had been embroiled in a land dispute. Jones had reportedly sworn that Walton would, quote, never quietly enjoy that piece of ground. Now, it was hard to believe that she physically threw the stones. The scale and the duration of the attack seemed well beyond the capabilities of one old woman. Some people blamed George Walton himself. After all, he was a Quaker. In the eyes of some Puritans, being a Quaker was almost as bad as being a sorcerer. Of course, blaming Walton made no sense at all. He was the victim. Walton also employed 2 Indians, who naturally became the targets of harsh words and baseless paranoia. In the end, everyone decided that the whole episode just had to be the work of demons. The Puritan minister Cotton Mather even preached about this whole business, using it as a warning to his flock about the dangers of the devil amongst us. Interestingly, the phenomenon ceased when Chamberlain finally checked out of the tavern. Now, the haunting had wider implications. New Hampshire had recently separated from Massachusetts to become its own province, and there were political tensions in the air. People tried to cobble together a political motivation for these attacks. After all, Chamberlain was a government official, and the phenomenon seemed to start when Chamberlain arrived, and it ended when he left. Well, that had to mean something. Some modern skeptics have suggested that Chamberlain himself might have perpetrated an elaborate hoax. But why? What could he gain from staging these attacks? What could he gain from making up such a bizarre story? Well, I guess the book he wrote brought in some money, but not a great deal, and certainly not enough to make up for the damage to his reputation. I don't see how that book could have done any favors to his political career. And why George Walton? Was there something about him? Was there something about the property? If the land was haunted, why did the haunting stop? To the best of my knowledge, Newcastle is not considered a hotspot for the supernatural nowadays, but back in 1682, everyone in the region was talking about witchcraft, and thus the stage was set for the Salem witch trials. That grim episode took place a decade later, and I would go so far as to suggest that no one would have died at Salem if the strangeness at Walton's Tavern had not made the supernatural realm seem dangerously near. If poltergeists exist, then one of them made history in Newcastle. If poltergeists do not exist, then whatever is mistaken for them made history. Not having seen a demonstration of the phenomenon, I don't know if lithobolia is real, but I do know that there have been other cases. Paranormal writer D. Scott Rogo investigated one such event in Big Bear, California in 1962. One could also mention the 1981 Thornton Road mystery in Birmingham, England. The Stone-Throwing Devil of Newcastle is a tale that combines elements of ghost story, witch hunt, political intrigue, and religious zealotry. And it was all set against the backdrop of colonial New England. If you ever get the chance to take a picturesque walk along the rocky shores of Newcastle, remember George Walton and carry a very stout umbrella because there may be precipitation. Our second story, Manhattan's first great murder mystery. New York, New York, it is a haunted town. If you go to 129 Spring Street in Manhattan, you'll encounter a trendy clothing store called COS. Although the store looks very sleek and modern, there is a very old brick well in the basement. A well which was once very famous. Supposedly, it is haunted by the ghost of a woman named Gulielma Sands, usually called Elma Sands. Her premature demise gave rise to one of the most remarkable trials in American history. Historians call this affair the Manhattan Well murder mystery. In the early years of the Republic, the Manhattan Well murder of 1799-1800 was America's first sensational criminal case. It was a scandalous affair, and it captivated New York City because it combined sex and romance and jealousy and wealth and fame and homicide. The mystery remains unsolved to this day. Elma Sands was a pretty, vivacious 22-year-old woman. She lived in a house on Greenwich Street, owned by her cousin Catherine Ring and Catherine's husband, Elias. This was a boarding house, and Elma caught the eye of several men who also had rooms in that home. One of those men was Levi Weeks, a 23-year-old carpenter. Levi was not yet a great success in life, although his brother Ezra was an architect who was very well known and who had done quite well for himself. The mystery began on the evening of December the 22nd, 1799, not long after the death of George Washington. Elma left the house with someone. Her companion was heard by others in the house, but was not seen. A friend spotted Elma briefly on Greenwich Street with an unidentified male. They both quickly disappeared into the shadows. Other witnesses believed that they had seen Elma later that night, riding in a sleigh with two men, a sleigh which resembled one owned by Ezra Weeks, Levi's rich brother. And that was the last time anyone would see Elma Sands alive. Levi Weeks returned to the boarding house at 10 p.m. He didn't seem particularly worried or upset about anything. He claimed that he had not seen Elma at all that evening. This claim seemed very odd, since everyone in the house presumed that he was the one who had escorted her out the door, although no one had actually seen him with her as she left. Days passed, no sign of Elma. Worry gave way to panic. All sorts of rumors sprang up. Had Elma run off with her boyfriend? Did she find someone else? Did something happen to her? The answer came in a horrifying discovery on January the 2nd, 1800. Elma's body was found at the bottom of the Manhattan Well in Lispenard's Meadow, about half a mile from the boarding house. The well belonged to the Manhattan Company, a private water utility recently established by none other than Aaron Burr, the former New York senator. Later, Burr would become vice president under President Thomas Jefferson. Later still, he instigated a weird, ambitious plot to become the ruler of his own country. And of course, as everyone knows, he eventually killed Alexander Hamilton in that famous duel. Both Burr and Hamilton play important roles in this story. Elma was dragged out of the well. Her body showed signs of bruising. Her dress was torn. Other than that, the evidence was frustratingly inconclusive. Did she fall into the well? Was she pushed? Was she already dead when she went in? No one could say. Elma's parents made the gruesome decision to put her corpse on exhibition outside the boarding house. Crowds flocked to view the body and to speculate on her fate. The press dubbed it the Manhattan Well murder. Suddenly, everyone had a theory as to what happened to poor Elma Sands. All eyes turned to Levi Weeks. As Elma's rumored fiancé and the last person known to have seen her alive, he quickly became the prime suspect. On January the 10th, a grand jury indicted Weeks for Elma's murder. The indictment of Levi Weeks ignited a citywide frenzy. The public had been inflamed by propaganda pamphlets produced by one Richard Croucher, another resident of the same boarding house. Croucher carpeted the city with handbills proclaiming the guilt of Levi Weeks. These broadsides claimed that Levi Weeks had, horror of horrors, been having sex on a regular basis with Elma Sands, and naturally all respectable New Yorkers were shocked. If ever a man was convicted in the court of public opinion, that man was Levi Weeks. Many believed that he had gotten Elma pregnant, and killed her to avoid marriage. Levi Weeks had a powerful ally in his corner, his older brother Ezra. Ezra had money. He hired the best legal team money could buy, none other than Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, the two most famous lawyers in the country. Those two guys didn't like each other. Even in 1800, everybody knew that they didn't get along, and eventually, of course, they fired pistols at each other. But for the duration of the Levi Weeks case, they buried their differences. In fact, they managed to work together very, very effectively. They were joined by another top legal talent, Henry Brockholst Livingston. He later became a Supreme Court justice. The trial began on March the 31st, 1800. It was a spectacle. New Yorkers never saw anything like it before. The courtroom was packed. The crowd spilled out into the streets. This was the first murder trial in U.S. history to be fully transcribed by a court stenographer, and that ensured that every dramatic moment would be printed in the newspapers and preserved for posterity. Presiding over the case was Chief Justice John Lansing Jr. of the New York Supreme Court. The prosecution was led by up-and-coming lawyer Cadwallader David Colden, who would later become mayor of New York. The prosecution's case seemed strong. Witnesses placed Levi with Elma on the night of her disappearance. Another witness claimed to have seen Weeks taking measurements at the well just days before the murder. The implication was clear. Levi had planned the killing well in advance. But Hamilton and Burr were not about to let their client go down without a fight. They launched a multi-pronged defense, and by modern standards, what they did was infuriatingly misogynistic. Basically, they attacked Elma's character. They painted her as promiscuous and unstable. They portrayed her as a laudanum addict. Maybe, they argued, she simply got inebriated and fell into that well. But that wasn't their only argument. The defense team proved that Elma had not been pregnant, which means that the most popular theory of motive no longer made any sense. Weeks had a good alibi for his whereabouts that night. Several witnesses saw him elsewhere. Excellent witnesses testified that the sleigh had remained in its berth on that night. Thus, those who thought they had seen Elma riding around in Levi's sleigh must have been mistaken. The defense team cast suspicion on other men in Elma's life. One of those men was fellow boarder Richard Croucher. Yes, the same guy who had done so much to inflame public opinion against Levi Weeks. In an ironic twist, Croucher would later be convicted of raping a 13-year-old girl. Throughout the trial, Hamilton and Burr put on one hell of a show. They meticulously cross-examined witnesses. They poked holes in the prosecution's timeline. They sowed doubt at every turn. Finally, the case went to the jury, and they took only 5 minutes to reach a verdict. Not guilty. Levi Weeks was a free man. Public outrage was volcanic. Everyone assumed that Ezra Weeks had corrupted the legal process. Everyone assumed that wealth had trumped justice. Levi Weeks found himself ostracized, and he was in no small amount of genuine danger. To avoid the mob's wrath, Levi Weeks fled the city. Eventually, he settled in Natchez, Mississippi, where he reinvented himself as an architect. He married, had 4 children, and lived until 1819, dying at the age of 43. One of the houses he designed in Natchez is now a National Historic Landmark. It's the Auburn Mansion in Duncan Park. Definitely worth a visit, if you're in the area. The murder of Elma Sands remains officially unsolved to this day. Over the years, the Manhattan Well murder became a cautionary tale. The city grew and became ever more dangerous. As the years progressed, young women in New York were often told that if they did not behave themselves, they might end up like Elma. Over the years, this murder case has been the subject of books, plays, and radio dramas. It even gets a shout-out in the musical Hamilton. Around the time of the Civil War, New Yorkers spread reports of supernatural events around the well. It was said that Elma's spirit would manifest. Flashes of light, strange sounds, the occasional full-bodied apparition. The well still exists. You may be able to see it for yourself if you go to Manhattan and visit 129 Spring Street. It's in the basement of a trendy Soho clothing store called COS. In the past, there have been numerous reports of paranormal activity at this location. Flying bottles and other objects, faucets running on their own, odd lights. Some have even claimed that they've heard screaming, cries for help. I say if Elma's ghost really wants to be useful, she should tell us who killed her. Does she still make her presence known? Well, maybe you should ask the employees of that shop. I think they'll be willing to talk to you. If you can afford retail prices in Manhattan. That puts me out of the picture. Our third and final story, The Lost Silver Bell of Providence, Rhode Island. In 1998, a writer named W.C. Jameson published a book titled Buried Treasures of New England. This book is the only source I can find for a remarkable story. It's the tale of a massive silver bell created in 1663 by a silversmith named Peter Seest of Amsterdam. I will summarize a lot of history as briefly as possible. This incredibly valuable bell, again, it's made entirely of silver, ended up atop a church in Providence. There it rang for more than 90 years. In 1756, the bell was relocated to England. Nobody knows why. In its new home, it served a convent. At some unspecified date, Jameson says, pirates raided the convent and absconded with the bell. Its whereabouts remained mysterious until the War of 1812, when the American Navy captured a British warship. This ship, it is said, happened to have the Great Silver Bell stowed in its hold. The silver artifact was returned to its former church in Providence. Eventually, the time came for that church to be replaced. As construction began, the bell was taken to the rectory. The transportation of the bell was overseen by the groundskeeper of the church. He was a one-eyed hunchbacked misanthrope named Grayson, an outcast in the community. Grayson had a terrible limp due to one leg being 8 inches shorter than the other. While the tower was being rebuilt, Grayson visited an inn and met with a gang of pirates. Yes, there are more pirates in this story. Patrons overheard him offering to sell the incredibly valuable bell. I presume that the pirates wanted to melt it down. But the deal went south when the perpetually surly groundskeeper said something that annoyed one of the brigands. They attacked him with a knife. The next day, Grayson's corpse, his throat was slashed, was found on the beach. Thus, the only person who knew the bell's location took the secret to his grave. The bell is thought to be secreted somewhere in downtown Providence, probably in the basement of a very old building. Imagine it, all that silver, yours for the taking, if you can find it. Or so says W.C. Jameson. It occurs to me that some people may consider this tale unlikely. Google offers no mention of Peter Seest, silversmith extraordinaire. Frankly, I doubt that silver would be a plausible metal for the making of a giant, functional church bell. I know that silver is a very soft metal, softer than gold. And let's face it, that bit about the one-eyed limping hunchback, yeah, that really is a bit much. And as for that yarn about pirates raiding a convent in England in the late 1700s, well, that whole thing seems fishier than Mr. Limpet. Bottom line, it sure would have been nice if Jameson had provided a few footnotes, but he didn't. So, who is this W.C. Jameson fellow? Well, he once appeared on the Coast to Coast radio program. I did not hear that episode. The following is from an online bio. W.C. Jameson is the award-winning and best-selling author of more than 70 books and over 1,500 articles and essays. In addition, he is an accomplished songwriter and performer, having recorded 5 albums of his original music and acted in 5 films. He has written the soundtracks for 4 films and wrote and performed in the musical Whatever Happened to the Outlaw Jesse James. A little further on, Jameson is the creator of the Buried Treasures of America series. His success and fame as a professional treasure hunter has led to appearances on television's Unsolved Mysteries, the Travel Channel, the Discovery Channel, Nightline, and National Public Radio. Jameson is the best-selling treasure author in the world. Well, that sounds impressive. Apparently, in 2018, someone made a documentary about W.C. himself. To the best of my knowledge, that film has never been released. He also wrote an autobiography, which I have not yet read. I'm definitely not disparaging this guy. I simply have a few questions about this particular story. At this point, All I can say is, read the man's works and decide for yourself, and if you can find an original source for the story of the Great Silver Bell of Providence, I am all attention. And if you find the bell itself, well, I beseech you to remember the humble Fortean YouTuber who first brought this story to your notice. I mean, with all that silver, you could afford to be a little generous. For the rest of you, I ask only the usual: like and subscribe, and spread the word. For now, I am back in the business of true life mysteries.